Great, thank you. So, as I said, my name's Sam. I'm a Scrum Master at a company called New Members. Today I'm going to talk about, when I tried to make it obvious, but just in case it's still not clear, the 5 dysfunctions of the team by a guy called Patrick Lencioni. So teamwork to me is one of those things that I think it's kind of a word that doesn't really mean anything anymore, like accountability or empowerment or like hipster. It has lost its meaning. But I think it's the thing that is the most sustainable advantage you can have over your competitor, more than technology, more than planning, more than finance, more than like kind of all those sorts of things. I just feel that teamwork is the thing that whenever I've been in a situation where I've had a team functioning well, things have always gone better than when I've had all of those other things behind me. I think that the first thing to talk about though is why do we think teamwork is an advantage? So I kind of just asking you guys, so what is it you think makes a great team better than a good team, or in fact just a bad team? What would you say is the advantage of that? Anyone? Okay, go for it.
People know what they're doing.
Okay. It's interesting. In what context?
Sorry?
So know what they're doing in terms of know what each other is doing, or know what the...
Know what each other is doing, know what they're supposed to be doing, knowing when they're supposed to be doing it.
So all contexts. Excellent. It's pretty safe. Okay. So, I mean, what else do we think? What other things do... And just say a good team versus a great team or a bad team versus... Because you can have a... if we think about what a team might be as a sort of definition, a team would just be sort of 2 or more people with the same aim. Now, it doesn't necessarily make them good or bad, but that would make them a team. I mean, you could argue 2 people trapped in the cave-in, they became a team because they both have the same aim. Doesn't mean they're going to get out, which probably makes them that would make them a good team or a bad team. So, why would a great team have an advantage over a not so great team? Synergy. Okay. So why would they be more productive? I think it's a good thing, but what makes them more productive? So thinking particularly in things like decision making.
Shared knowledge, working with friends.
Shared knowledge, nice. And that is important. And essentially, I think something about shared knowledge is important. Not only do... Oh,
They have different knowledge.
yeah.
Added together, they have a broader knowledge.
So they're the combination of their parts.
Sorry, what was that?
So the team is a combination of its parts. So it's greater. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, essentially. Yep, that's true, and I think yeah, that's a really fair point. To be fair, they are in fact a much if you think of the team as being just sort of a series of skills available to everyone, then suddenly everyone is more capable. That's a fair point. So I think you become more productive because I think that you make decisions more quickly, and I'll explain this later. I find that when teams work well. Absolutely. Well, trust is the foundation, and we'll get onto that. But trust is vital. Trust is vital for a good team. I find that happier people, I tend to find great teams, people are just happier, and that tends to be something that whilst I feel it's a bit intangible, contributes to everything that someone does. And actually, you end up keeping staff as a result of that. Turnover of staff because they're unhappy is actually a really disruptive thing. Okay, so Does anyone feel that being a great team is not better than being a good team or a bad team? Does anyone think it offers no advantage whatsoever? Brilliant. That's actually the right answer. Correct. Thank you. Okay. So before we get into the model for Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions, first thing I want to sort of mention is you kind of want to check that you are in fact. So 2 things you want to check. Firstly is you want to check, are you really a team? Do you have the same goals? Are everyone travelling in the same direction? Now, don't get me wrong. It seems like an obvious question, of course we are, but actually when you ask that question to a group of people, sometimes you'll be surprised. And I think having a bad team that's all travelling in the right direction is marginally better than having a bad team that's not travelling in the right direction. It's just marginally. But what you also have in that situation is you have the foundation of actually making a team. You have a group of people with the same aim, and this is really important. I definitely recommend asking people, if any of you who are in teams or work with teams, asking them what is our aim, and seeing what the response to that is. You'll find it quite interesting. And then the other thing which is important is that are they committed to being a team? And do they understand what they're about to undertake? So I think building a great team is actually very simple. There's no science or magic or voodoo involved. It's actually very simple steps you need to go through. But what I also think is that it's really hard work. Gentleman at the back.
Do you have to have the same aim? Does everybody in the team have to have the same aim to be part of the team? For that team to be a team?
Well, I think they would. I mean, it would be strange. Why are they not separate teams if they have separate aims? Why are they? I mean,
have separate reasons for achieving the aim.
That's true.
They need to work together to the same aim.
Yeah, and actually, if they have, look, you can have a group of people that we call a team, and if they have separate aims, are you ever going to be able to make that team see eye to eye on issues? Are they ever going to be able to agree on the way forward? So if one person wants one thing and one person wants another thing, and we need to make one decision, whose goal are we trying to satisfy? And is that going? And I kind of feeling that the outcome of that might be a small amount of conflict. Yeah.
Might not be an answer of contribution. I mean, I think a big aim, a big goal, a big achievement to be achieved.
Mm-hmm.
Split up the smaller parts. The smaller teams, which are part of the larger team, don't have to.
Okay, so actually.
Be aware of
So and I know what you're saying. So what you're saying is that actually within an organisation you might have sales and you might have marketing and you might have kind of technology, and they've all got their individual. And I might argue that what you're talking about here is responsibilities in achieving the aim of the company, which normally, once you've kind of got past the initial thing is to make money. If you've ever read The Goal. But it's the cleaner part of the team.
Well, as long as the aims are aligned, they don't have to be the same.
There's more to a team than that, right? So not only you kind of suggested shared purpose, but there are other things we go on and shared value. I think the thing that distinguishes the team is this anti-fragile. That's my definition.
Okay.
So it can take knocks because it's able to adapt its shape from the attributes within it to be able to adapt, to take change.
I'd say that.
So it doesn't have the personality, it doesn't have those qualities. It's anti-fragile, right? They have a shared purpose, they have a shared set of values, they have a shared goal, and that means, and they will work together, not to achieve that goal, but also in the event of somebody, believing the team is anti-fragile, is able to adapt to cope with that change because they share that responsibility collectively.
Yes.
To remold themselves.
Absolutely. I think that's a really reasonable thing to say. A team is strong because of that.
In fact, I would agree with this guy. Don't know what the hell anti-fragile means, but as long as they've got the same purpose, then aims don't have to.
Okay. In fact, then let me reclassify. Let's use purpose instead of aim, because I think I may mean the same thing as you. I think we're perhaps having a semantic argument rather than an actual sort of discussion about the issue. So a team, in fact, is 2 or more people with a shared purpose rather than aim. Okay. is that okay? Does everyone feel comfortable? I feel like I've backtracked now, but that's kind of, it's important that I completely agree with what you said, and I think you're right to say it. I think I meant, with aim, I meant purpose. But to me, the two things are very, very similar, if not the same. I probably need to think about that a bit more before I confirm it, though. Okay, so back to making a team. I do think it's the ways to do it are quite simple, and I'm not saying that the model I'm going to present today is all-encompassing. I don't think it is. But I don't think that there is much voodoo involved. I don't think it's something that you need to kind of magic out of nothing. I think there are some obvious and simple ways to do it. I do think it's a lot of work, though, and I think people have to put themselves in a very discomforting place to achieve it. So this is the model, and I just want to talk a little bit about this model as a whole rather than its individual parts. Patrick Lencioni, he wrote a book, sort of the 5 Temptations of a CEO, and what he realised is that actually when he was coaching people, they were taking what he wrote about sort of business executives and actually they were applying it to teams. He sort of went, oh, okay. So with a bit of reworking, he realised that what he'd also done is written a book basically about the problems, the temptations of a CEO were also the temptations of a team. The model itself, and whilst it is in 5 separate sections, the whole thing is actually interlaced. And to describe them as separate would not be fair. So they're all interlinked. One leads to the other, and in fact, if you have a problem in any one of these, any one of these problems, it will cascade into the other ones. Having sort of applied this to teams, I've seen a lot of the stuff. A lot of stuff I've used has worked, and sometimes it hasn't worked. But I see a lot of these things occurring in many of the teams I've been in. So the first one, the foundation, which is the absence of trust, the fear of conflict, which is the second one, lack of commitment, avoidance, accountability, and inattention to results. So the 5 dysfunctions that he talks about. One thing it's really important to recognise is that the meaning, the actual definitions for a lot of these words are very specific, and I will talk about that next. So we'll go into the first one, the first dysfunction, which is an absence of trust. Oh, interesting. Okay, so an absence of trust. So Patrick Lencioni has a specific definition, and the absence of trust. I mean, so you mentioned trust. Who mentioned trust? Ah, you did mention trust. So when you said that, what did you mean by trust?
It's trusting that the other people are capable of doing the job, really.
Interesting.
I mean, for us, we had a huge issue with sort of sizing, and we consulted for a company. They went, well, I don't see why it takes that long, and there was no. I thought they were, we think we can do it in this time, and they're not developers. The developers were getting really annoyed because they go, well, there's no trust. They don't believe that after doing our job for 20 years, we can estimate and come up with reliable.
So trust is actually sort of expecting someone to behave how they're supposed to behave. It's a really good definition of trust, and it's actually the traditional one, but it's not the one in this model, which is fine actually, and I get what you said. So let me ask a question: does anyone know someone they work with or has worked with someone that is that guy that never ever admits they've made a mistake? Or a few people. Does anyone even know someone like that? Family is a really good example of this. Right. So this is why families kind of push your buttons, because they never admit they're wrong, right? And then sometimes they're all, at the same breath, suddenly they're completely capable of admitting they're completely wrong or supporting you in a really wonderful way. But yet they just, in that small moment, you go, you never admit that. So the type of trust that we're talking about, Patrick Lencioni talks about, is vulnerability-based trust. And this is actually the ability for people to actually kind of recognize their limitations and actually own up. So the guy that never admits they're wrong, or never kind of lets you know, when he has an opinion, there's no point telling him your opinion is different because he's just not going to listen. Would you trust him to value your thoughts and opinions on the product? No. You don't. So the vulnerability-based trust is simply the ability for team members, and I want to stress that this is the foundation of pretty much any great team. It's just the ability to everyone to say, I don't know how to do that, or I messed up, I made a mistake. You're better than that. You're better at that than I am. Those sorts of vulnerability-based kind of actions are the things that really help teams trust each other. So taking that into account, if we think about kind of where there might be an absence of trust, what do we think are the signs that what are the things that people would show if there is an absence of trust in the team? What behaviours do you think we would witness? Disengagement. Sorry, what was it you said at the back?
Sorry, I said arguments. So argue about how to implement something. Because everybody thinks that his opinion is better than other people's.
How do you think those arguments would go? Because it's quite important. Do you think that arguing is a bad? Who thinks that arguing within a team is a bad thing?
Well, it depends on the type of arguments. If somebody walks out in anger, then that's not an argument you are looking for.
So emotional argument.
Yeah,
Okay, cool. Sorry, so what is it you said? Disengaged. Interesting. Anything else?
Learning as well perhaps is a factor. People can see or admit being wrong. Perhaps they don't leave room for learning.
So there's no skill improvement.
Yeah.
It's actually a really, really good one. Sorry.
No skill improvement for whom?
So people in the team, and the reason I've put this one down was because A, it was said and I was putting them all down, but also because one of the things that people, when they don't admit they're wrong about things, they tend to close themselves to finding out how they could be correct, right? I mean, that's the normal behaviour. I mean, I'm right, so I don't need to learn. And that's why I would say skill, and certainly skill improvement. I'm not saying that suddenly people aren't going to improve what they do, but they're certainly not going to improve their skill within the context of whatever the purpose of the team is, because they're not prepared to open up and go, well, maybe I've got the wrong idea here.
Isn't trust more fundamental than that? Isn't that a lack of trust more fundamental?
Well, in the context of this model, so and again, and that's why I kind of made pains to point out that the trust has a very specific meaning here. So you're probably right. The word trust, the semantic meaning of trust, is.
I mean, in this context,
Okay,
in
yeah.
the context of a team,
Yeah.
I don't have any trust in the fact that you will produce what you say or that you will do what you say you will do. If I can't trust that.
And that's the traditional meaning of trust. That's the type of trust I was trying to say was not the specific meaning of. This is more vulnerability.
In which case, I'm a little hazy on what you mean by trust. Then.
Okay, so trust in Patrick Lencioni's terms is simply the ability of team members to trust each other to be vulnerable. It's vulnerability-based trust. The ability for people to be actually just acknowledge that they've made mistakes, that they don't have the skill sets to achieve a job and need help with that, and just the ability to kind of be humble in front of around their peers.
Example of that might be in my team. I've had a few situations where people won't let go of stories. It's always going to be tomorrow. It's always going to be tomorrow, and then it'll be a week, and it gets to the second week, and you think, look, just admit.
Interesting.
You're not doing it. You can't get on with it. You can't finish it. But hand it over. So no, I'm going to finish it. I can do this.
Interesting. Yeah, that's quite a good example. Right? So that's someone just not being able to. And in a way, when we really start to believe in something, because we're very good at convincing ourselves, right, that we're capable of doing something that we're not. And then the more you convince, or pretty much anything, we're really good at convincing ourselves that what we think is correct. I mean, that's an amazing skill we have. So I've got a great example of recently I've recently worked with a guy who was a product owner, and he, unsolicited, said to me, he said, I can change my mind any time I want. And so, which unsolicited, I was kind of my disingenuous response was, that's nice. It's just great. He doesn't. And in my head, I'm going, oh my God, no. Because anyone that wants to unsolicited it feels like probably he's been accused of this in the past, isn't very good at it, but really wants to get himself in, talk about it quickly. And as it turns out, he actually is an incredibly stubborn person. And it causes lots of problems. And trust no one trusts each other. The communication, for instance, one of the things that you would look for is just the ability for two people to talk. So arguments might get, if they have them, they'll be emotional, but actually is equally often meetings are boring because no one wants to raise their opinion. Oh, well, I disagree, but if I disagree, he's just going to shout me down, not listen, and it'll be a waste of my time and emotional effort. I'll just be tired as a result, and we'll have got no further. So vulnerability-based trust is important because it also means that people are prepared to listen to the ideas of other people. Now,
so it's almost the flip side of the traditional meaning, because the traditional meaning is, in your case, you don't trust him to complete the job. He doesn't trust you to hand it over and say, well, actually, I can't, which is the vulnerability side. So.
Yeah, I mean, actually, no. I think it sort of flips. Yeah, I guess it's definitely it's definitely different. It's definitely far from the tradition.
Another interpretation could be trusting the other to be honest with you. So
exactly. So one of the reasons you're less productive with a bad team is that mistakes get recognised much later because no one's admitting to them. So you spend ages going in the wrong direction until some. It's really expensive. It's really expensive. And I think, and this is why this is the foundation, because without this trust, the ability to be open and honest, you can't make the progress that you should be that you need to make. And actually, it prevents the sorts of learning and the sorts of idea sharing that, to be honest, a lot of people in like an Agile community kind of take for granted a little bit, to be honest. I mean, the fact that we're stood here is a sign of open-mindedness. I'm presenting this because I've used these things and I found they've worked. And I'm not saying they're correct, I'm not saying the model is sort of comprehensive, and certainly there are many things that clearly can't be accounted for by this model, but I can only tell you that when I've recognised and used these things, I found the progress to be incredible. And
is it a judgmental failure then? This is judgmental failure.
What do you mean by that?
Well, making kind of moral assumptions that somebody fails, it's a kind of moral deficit in their character or in their ability.
Well, I mean, yeah, because we teach kids this, right? Failure is a bad thing according to traditional, this kind of, if you don't pass your exams, that's a bad thing. And kind of admitting your mistakes or like losing sport, that's a bad thing. So we definitely train this into people. We train invulnerability into people from an early age. And pretty much, I personally, if I had to recruit someone between who said I got an A in this result, I got an A in this exam, and I have no idea how I achieved it, and someone said I got a D, but I know exactly what I did wrong, I want the guy with a D. I want him with a D because he's more vulnerable. He's more used to me because he can admit what's gone wrong. But the problem is the person with the D just won't ever reply because they're ashamed of it. So, make sense so far? Okay. We can sit down afterwards, definitely. Over pizza, we'll talk again. But okay, so what is this absence of trust? What does this lead to? We talked about it briefly, but the next dysfunction is essentially it's a fear of conflict. Okay. So fear of conflict is basically where a team cannot enter into an impassioned debate. And the lady in the back there said that when I asked whether arguments are... Interesting. So when I said, is arguing bad, I actually think the opposite is true. I think that arguing is brilliant. The best example I can give, I work with two guys called Dan and Claudio. And they're on the team together. And they've been working together for a while. And they were having essentially what appeared to be a stand-up row about something. A full-on kind of it was frustrating. It was emotional, to be fair. But at no point did they talk about anything but the issue. And eventually, at the end of this, they kind of they made a decision. And one of the guys on another team near them went, do you guys need a bit of time apart? And they were like, well, no. We just both believed really strongly in an idea. They happened to be different, and we had it out, and now we have a plan. And it was beautiful. And I sort of went after and I said, don't, that's amazing. What you guys just did was brilliant. And everyone here should be looking at that as an example as how to, because debate should be impassioned. It should be this amazing kind of thing that allows people to sort of, really express themselves. And they should be in an environment where it's okay to do that. And that's why trust is so important.
Well, it's good then that your team member managed to reach agreement. I can give you a very good example of two people in a team I used to work with. They're strongly disagreeing with each other. They're shouting and calling out each other names towards the end. And then towards the end, you know what they did? Basically, one person were checking the code, the other person were check out, delete, and their check is put back in again.
Wow. Okay.
So
That
that's another
sounds like an issue. I do have a warning. I have a warning at the end. It might be relevant. So Dan and Claudio, basically, these guys are able to have that sort of impassioned debate and then not take it personally.
Exactly.
And it was amazing. At the end of it, oh sorry.
The difference in the two scenarios is respect. Those guys respect each other's opinions. They value their own, but they listen to the others. These guys aren't listening to or respecting each other's opinions, regardless of how passionate they are about their own.
And part of that respect comes from the trust that they've got. It's massive because they trust them to be honest about, there's no pretense here. They know they're being honest with each other, that he really believes this.
So conflicts should be managed, right? We shouldn't conflicts.
Absolutely, conflict should be managed. So, I mean, talking about the fear of conflict, I mean, what do we, again, recognising things that fear of conflict, obviously people aren't debating. So meetings are boring. That's kind of the thing that leads on. So I think team members also, you kind of start to witness people kind of posturing and really trying to control their emotions as well. And this is like my favourite one is watching people roll their eyes. I love seeing this in a meeting environment where someone goes, oh, and at that point that they are scared of they're worried, they don't trust someone enough to be able to air their opinion. Rolling eyes is my favourite one. Sorry, did you just roll your eyes? Ah, interesting. So the other thing that tends to happen, and this is one of my favourite sort of phrases in work, and it always sort of feels like it's slang for we shall never talk of this again until possibly we have another meeting, which is, well, we can take that offline. It's me and you take that offline and never discuss it until it comes up again in another meeting and then we can avoid it. I know, right? It's just, okay, why not talk about it now?
If you've only got a set time for a meeting and you know you're going to have a quite drawn out, because there's two people with different ideas.
I know what they mean when they say take it offline. It's just like, how do you want about take it offline? We're not online.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? It doesn't even, I know, it's bizarre in its very conception.
We don't have to suffer for the rest of it.
I think one of the other biggest markers of this fear of conflict is people become cliquey. They kind of
Backroom politics. They don't solve the issue, and actually to avoid conflict, to upset someone, sometimes people kind of will say, oh, I didn't want to upset him, so I didn't mention it. And then all that happens is this more destructive thing to the relationship happens, which is then they actually just resent that person that they felt they couldn't.
So to be able to do that, the conflict needs to have rules, boundaries. Yeah? Now, if you don't have any trust in those boundaries, you don't have trust in the person that you're arguing with or you potentially argue with, which leads me back to the trust thing. I think it's more trust in the traditional sense than it is trust in this, God knows what, lack of ability to trust each other to vulnerability. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, fair enough. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I mean, what I can't ask you to do is accept what I'm saying. And in fairness, I mean, personally, again, I've applied this and I feel like I've seen this happen. I may have just bought into a cult, though. I may be brainwashed. So one of the things about resolving this, and something that you talked about, kind of having rules. Setting rules is actually a really good way to resolve this. I think another one is another thing I love doing to get people to not fear conflict. There's two types of things I can do, which is one is I'll get someone to mine for conflict, who's there deliberately, and everyone knows is there deliberately to start a row. And suddenly people stop taking it personally, because that's his job in this meeting. He is the devil's advocate, or is the person that kind of makes you guys were about to discuss something, so maybe you should, and actually getting people to take that role and share it. Making conflict a little bit fun has a massive effect. The other thing about the argument side of things, because most people think that arguing is bad. And I'd imagine a lot of people and a lot of your teams will think that actually having a stand-up row, an impassioned debate is a bad thing. And it's the effect of just going, guys, this is great. You actually are dealing with an issue. The effect of that can be quite profound, to be fair. And I guess one of the final things I would always try and do is kind of just let people make sure that when they are flustered, because when you are in the heat of an argument, it's difficult to think of the next thing, right? If you've had that thing where later on you go, shit, I should have said that, right? And you don't do it. And recognizing that and just letting people be pulled away to take a moment to think is a really good way of resolving it. Okay, so people aren't discussing things, there's no conflict, there's no resolution, there's no decision making, things are coming back, there's loads of backwater politics. What do we get next? We get something called lack of commitment. And again, lack of commitment is, just to let you know, is again quite specific here. By commitment, he means two things. Patrick Lencioni means two things. One is clarity, and the other one is buy-in. So without impassioned debate, or even just really in-depth discussion, because there's no trust, so why would we bother? The results that people come out with, or the decisions people come out with, not everyone believes in them. Not because they haven't had their say. They think there's a better way of doing this, but I've not been able to express this, right? So we're going to do this. Actually, I have a better idea, but I can't really say anything because you'll just shout me down. So now I just don't believe in your response. But what that also means is there's generally a lack of clarity. Things get moved on really quickly. Because it's, oh, we're going to do this, great, okay, fine. And suddenly, no one's even sure what and who's supposed to be delivering what at what time. That happens, it becomes an issue of moving stuff on quickly rather than having the uncomfortable situation of people disagreeing and not being able to do anything about it. The other thing is buy-in. So with buy-in, and Intel have a saying for this, which is kind of disagree but commit. The notion is that if you just get to speak your mind freely, if you get to enter into impassioned debate, what then happens is that you, even if the decision isn't the one that you wanted, if people have listened to you and actually been given the opportunity to sort of speak their mind, if people have really felt they've contributed and what they said was taken seriously, they're actually then able to they're able to accept a decision that isn't the one they would have gone for. They're actually okay. And that concept has to be overt for them. They have to understand that the commitment after, that I can't promise. Who here thinks that every decision they have should be the one that happens? Who thinks that everything they think is the right thing? And so, and yet it's quite weird because some people want everything they think to happen, right? Everything I think to happen because I must be right. And yet, if you ask them the question, "Do you think you're right all the time?" It would be strange for them to say no. No, I'm never wrong. I'm never wrong. That's kind of weird, right? So the point is that accepting that not every idea you have is going to be the one we go with is important. And actually, sometimes with that kind of lack of commitment, that when people aren't being able to buy into things, some of the signs for that would be kind of decision paralysis. Things just keep coming up over and over again because no one can quite commit to it, or actually the answer they came up with is so vague or so unclear that actually it never really solved the problem in the first place, and then you've got the same issue again because no one really contributed and it was moved along quite quickly. There's also you get something as well, which you get which is a part of the decision paralysis, which is like a fear of failure. People don't want to make decisions because suddenly there's onus on them.
Sometimes you end up getting a single vision instead of a team vision.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good point, to be fair. Yeah, you'll end up getting one person's, and it tends to be the person that is the most aggressive that seems to be getting a lot of what they want. And also, in a more subtle way as well, you tend to get members of a team sort of second guessing without ever really seeking clarity what people mean, right? Oh, they must want this. And I don't know if any of you seen that behavior where someone makes a decision and rather than going and finding out, just people just make an assumption as to why it was done, right? So possibly lack of commitment, possibly there isn't enough. I like that. You agree a lot over there. She's good. She agrees. Right now, you're better than everyone because you agreed a lot. No. Okay. So resolving this. So something that might be worth doing, and it's quite an easy thing to resolve, in my opinion, this one, is that you just kind of want to make all the decisions clear. Write them up. Send them to everyone. Make everyone understand exactly what was agreed. Another one is kind of thinking about things like contingencies and getting people to recognise, think about what is the first sign that this was a bad decision. And the reason this is a good thing is because you're trying to encourage decision making, which seems to stall at this point. Right? So getting people to think about the potential risks of a decision, if they pretend to be quite low, then actually they're more willing to make a decision. And actually you've also then got a tool to recognise that quite early when it's going wrong. We've got an absence of trust, fear of conflict. We've now got a lack of commitment from the team because no one's really either making decisions or buying into decisions. So this leads on to the fourth dysfunction, which is the avoidance of accountability. Yeah. Okay, so what are we looking for when people are avoiding accountability? What do we think are the behaviours you might see?
Blaming somebody else. So other team's fault.
Interesting. No, that is part of it. There's part of it, and there's actually another part. If someone,
It's not my fault.
yeah, no, yeah, definitely, it's not my fault. This is definitely someone's fault, by the way. This child is someone's fault, but two people. Oh yeah, no, right? Because a team. So and that's the first half of it. Absolutely. The second half is actually no one else is holding anyone to accountable either. So there is no clarity. There's no way to hold them accountable because the decisions were unclear in the first place. They didn't really buy in, right? So you didn't buy in. No one bought in. No, it wasn't really clear. So actually, pretty much anyone would just do what they want because it's just free reign. So one of the signs for this, and if I'm really honest, one of my favourite signs for this is just mediocrity. It's just average work because there's no one holding anyone account for doing something average. There's another really good subtle one, and I recommend trying an exercise where you kind of get people to describe what they consider their standards to be, or get what they consider other people's standards to be, is actually just a range of standards within a team. Where you've got one guy who's still got really high standards because he's quite proud as a professional, and then one other guy that doesn't care, and then everyone else just gets to fit somewhere in the middle. They set the scale, and what happens eventually, though, is the guy that's really proud leaves because he doesn't like being in this team, and it resets the marker of standards, so now everyone gets to be somewhere in the middle still, but it's just a smaller range, and it's the smaller range on the bad side.
Isn't that more kind of not demonstrated? It's more shown by people becoming more siloed within their team. So you have a team of different sort of skills, what have you. A decision has been made, or a lack of a decision has been made. So wherever that decision sprang from, well, that was nothing to do with me. I'm a tester.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is one half of it. That's definitely so. So actually, not kind of distancing yourself from the results is a fully like kind of an avoidance of accountability. Well, I didn't. It wasn't even my idea. I didn't even get to discuss it, and so I don't buy in, right? The reason that people tend not to say that is because the response is, well, why didn't you say anything? And that's just a conversation you don't want anyway. Because you don't care, because you're in a team that isn't very good. So that, where was I before that? Before accountability. So another, yeah, mediocrity, and then we actually have the. Forgive me. So yeah, so people do distance themselves from outcomes. That's actually, thanks. You made my last point. I appreciate it. So this what's interesting about this one though is that the other dysfunctions sort of really represent what a bad team does, but this one exists in good teams as well. And good teams can fall into this really quickly. And the reason that is if you have a good team or even a great team, what tends to happen is that people tend to be friends. They like each other, and they don't want to hold people accountable. Does that make sense? You don't want to go to someone you really like. Oh, dude, man, you messed up. You're rubbish. And I'm not saying that's the most tactful way of doing it, but that's kind of what they want to avoid completely. Because it's not fun. They don't want to do that because they like them. The problem with that, and they think that's the right thing to do, or certainly they're avoiding that emotional situation, which are completely understandable because like entering the sort of that emotional danger zone is not easy, right? But what happens then is that when those mistakes happen a few times, and this is even in really good teams, when those mistakes happen a few times, they start to resent that person for not seeing it. And actually, they're the ones that need to be calling it out. Then you need to basically, and I think if you're in charge of a team or you're within a team and you manage to instigate a process where somebody calls somebody out for not doing what they committed themselves to do, and somehow you've played a part, what you should do is secretly go off and buy yourself a drink and be quite satisfied with where you've got your team, because that is actually massive. In my opinion, it's massive. You should then get back and keep working because there's another dysfunction to go, but you should be very pleased with yourself. So things you want to kind of think about when doing this. Now, from a Scrum example, you might one of the things I like to do for accountability is just kind of compare the results with the sort of the stories we started with. It's quite simple, and just getting people to objectively. So, is this what we intended? Is this good enough? That sort of thing. And actually kind of instigating a situation where the team kind of get to call it out rather than one person at a time. You may even, if you're the product owner or manager or Agile king of whatever team you're involved with, you might want to be the person that sort of leads by example with this as well. So also, regular spot checking, I think, again, iterative sort of development has quite a good way of dealing with this, which is essentially checking quite over quick. The short feedback loop kind of makes this quite easy. And the other thing is that sort of clarity, writing these decisions up, but kind of in detail, who is doing what, and when are they supposed to do it by? Because the enemy of accountability or holding people accountable is ambiguity. Ambiguity is the enemy of a lot of things, but in this situation, it definitely prevents you from being able to say, well, you didn't do this well, because if you haven't got something very, very sort of clear, then you're not going to be able to do it. Any questions about avoidance accountability? That is a no. Excellent. So, people aren't holding each other to account because there's a lack of commitment, and so there's no kind of standards that they can actually hold people accountable to. There's a fear of conflict, so no one even cares about, no one really believes in the ideas anyway. And there's an absolute trust because no one's really talking about it. So eventually these end up leading to one final thing: inattention to results. So what happens is that once the other four dysfunctions are in place, this kind of ego-driven self-advancement starts to happen. And if you think about it in a kind of context of perhaps of a department, I think one of you gentlemen were talking about having sort of the marketing and the sales. And it's really interesting. Go, well, my department is doing great. So if it's like an executive team, for instance, who have all kind of achieved the main purpose of that company, but one of them's going, almost actually saying, well, marketing's brilliant. And the CTO's is that the technology isn't going great, but they don't care. The great team response is to be going, how can I help with the technology? Is there something I can do? But actually they don't. They're just not that interested. Sales is a really good example, right, of sales going, oh, by the way, we've sold this, could you now build it, right, without ever really just passing on the stress of that. I was actually in a conversation today with someone who was basically, their deadline was purely based on the fact that their sales department had sold a product that wasn't built, and they had to give a deadline to them. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, I might mention that tonight. Because that's a complete inattention to, inattention to the results of the company. That's just now my department's made a sale, I'm brilliant. But actually, he was pretty, and that's why they were getting more people on. Because they needed to, they now kind of have to throw resource. Because sales have made a commitment. Oh, it's horrendous. I mean, how would you feel if someone from your sales did that to you? You angry? Frustrated? Tough crowd. So again, things we're looking for inattention to results. So I would say that easily distracted is a really nice sign, because this is something where people go, oh yeah, I think I will do that now, rather than focusing on the purpose of the team, just kind of going off and doing something else that pretty much is in their own interest and not the team's interest. I think the language changes, and they tend to go, I've done this, not we've done this. That's quite an interesting one. And also, people aren't offering to help outside of their specific remit. Suddenly it's kind of, well, we're not managing, and everyone kind of head down, they're not involved. And that's basically some of the signs there. So I think things you can do, I think that the most important thing you can therefore do is make the team goal very visible all of the time. Make sure that individuals, and the team are rewarded when team goals are achieved, but not when their individual ones are achieved. And I think that's sort of, whilst I sort of think that the whole reward thing is a delicate subject in itself, it certainly helps reinforce the notion that the team is really important.
But if your team gets to that stage, how do you pull it back?
So it's a good question. So the next bit I wanted to talk about was overcoming those dysfunctions a little bit. And I'll tell you where I would start. I would start at the base. I would start at the absence of trust. If you solve this, because it's the foundation, again, as I said at the beginning, until you've solved this one, you cannot in any way approach the other four. Because you're not going to get the sorts of candid conversation about people's behaviours, about ideas to do with the product, about directions of the companies, just things we're not doing well. Without that vulnerability-based trust, you can't progress. So I would start there.
So you're saying that once you hit the first one, you're on a slippery slope. That's it. You've gone. You will get to number 5.
No. No, I think these are all interacted, and does anyone feel that any of these, they've never witnessed any of these dysfunctions? Because I think that's probably a good point. Is there any of these you've not witnessed?
I've witnessed every second, absolutely one of them.
Perfect. So what I'm not saying is that I'm not guaranteeing you that all of these dysfunctions exist in any team, be it good or awful. But what I am saying is that the dysfunctions, these 5, seem to, they interrelate. They're interlaced, kind of like a chain. Once the link breaks, the chain becomes less useful. So whilst I'm not sure that all of these exist, I think if one does, personally, when I've seen one, I've seen all. And when I've come into the team, now there's obviously a caveat to that, which is if you start to try and solve these things, then eventually you start to see some of the behaviours, but they tend to disappear and they become less amplified the more you work on these things.
They are a chain, though. They are sequential.
No, they're interlaced. So let's take this one. Let's take this one as an example.
But I can't see inattention to results happening without avoidance of accountability.
So there's the thing, right? It's interesting because I'll give you why I think that might not be true. Inattention to results, which is focusing on your own interests. And we have a very strong survival instinct, and it actually kicks in really quickly. Right? Our fight or flight, which is a great example of something that you have no control over. The only thing you can really control is how you pull yourself out of the fight or flight response. And when someone, and for whatever reason, if you misinterpret something, you can have all of these dysfunctions have gone from your team. And the minute you feel attacked, rightly or wrongly, suddenly you'll have an inattention to results. And this can rear its head at any moment. So it doesn't necessarily mean you need an avoidance. The avoidance of accountability exists. That can exist, but suddenly just one moment of misinterpretation or one moment of weakness in someone, and suddenly it's all self-preservation. And we are set up for this. As human beings, our brain has an amazing capacity to kind of make us think of number one very quickly. So I don't think it's necessary to have the other four for this one to happen. And I actually don't think it's necessary to have any of the other ones for the first instance of one of these things to happen. I think, though, if the first instance of one of these 5 things does happen, and you leave it, then it will spread quickly. Well, quickly, maybe not, but it will definitely spread. And it doesn't have to be the first one that happens. It doesn't have to be sequential. One thing will lead to the other things if you leave it unchecked. I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about that case, overcoming the absence of trust, because I think that's where I would start. And I think my warning would be, firstly, don't push this. This is sensitive, and it's actually in a way, it's the most subtle part to this. Now, the first thing I would do is, if you believe if you feel that this is something that actually has value and it makes sense to you, and you've seen these behaviors, then you might want to present this model to them. You might want to actually make awareness is a really good tool, right? Just them knowing that they as a team have an absence of trust is something that, because I don't think anyone wants to be, well, I'm sure there are a few people, but I think it would be the aberrational human that wanted to be part of a bad team. I think most people want to be part of good teams. So just knowing this is good. There's a couple of things that you can do. So I quite like something that a friend of mine, James, told me about, which was what he does with his team is he just gets them to write their job title down. Someone will put like a Rails developer, and someone will put QA. And then they write all their skills on a separate pieces of paper, and they put all of their skills in the middle of the table, and they hold on to their job title. And what you then do is just get a group of people to appreciate that, in fact, as a team, they're just a collection of those skills. Get them to tear away the bit of paper, write down team member on it again, and that actually kind of is nice, gets them to refocus what they are as a team, which is a collection of all of these skills, and all of these skills are now available to all of these people. That's quite a nice, simple start to this process. Another one is just in like a retrospective or even at the pub, just kind of ask 3 questions. So just sort of, how many siblings have you got? What was your worst job and your best job? Who was your inspiration growing up? Who was the most influential person you actually knew? And getting a group of people to sort of have empathy and understand people is actually really, really valuable. And I've done this, and every time I do that exercise, that last one I mentioned, I always think it's not going to work. And it always does, and something really powerful comes out of every session I've done with that. The only thing with that, though, as well, is be careful, because sometimes people actually tell you quite sensitive things, and you'll be really surprised. You need to be ready for that. You need to be prepared. And sometimes people go, I didn't have any inspiration. They've got nothing for you. But that's okay, too, because some people just, I just grew up, I enjoyed had a great childhood. I had no brothers and sisters, and this is my first job. And be prepared for that as well. It's okay. What else? Overcoming. Okay, so the other thing, and once you've kind of so that sort of personal history is a nice way to introduce empathy. I think things I also like are peer assessment. Now, peer assessment in an unofficial capacity, but getting a group of people to kind of talk about each member of their team. And you might want to start this by introducing it where they just talk about themselves. What is my strength? What do I add to this team? What weakness of mine holds this team back? Getting them to admit that's not a bad way to get them to be humble. But then actually getting a team to do that for the rest of the team, and that's a little bit further down once you feel comfortable with it, but actually saying, well, Craig there was brilliant, his inspiration, but when it comes to Agile meetups, he'll mispaint the picture slightly. So, that's fine. So just, that needs to be handled again with care, and I think it's something that you need to think about. You need to make sure that you're ready for that. And then other things, and I quite like this, and other people don't really believe in it, but things like the Myers-Briggs or like some other personality indicator test, I think that's quite good. And it's the weirdest thing when I've done this twice, where I've got a guy in to do the Myers-Briggs thing. The weirdest thing with it is people actually really like learning about themselves in front of other people. It's a bizarre thing, particularly when the guy that is really stubborn and never admits he's wrong does this Myers-Briggs thing, and it says, oh yeah, you're quite stubborn. He goes, oh yeah, I never admit when I'm wrong. I think everyone's going, yeah, I admit when you're wrong. And so that to me, those are the things I would probably look at. So trust is where I would hit. And you can, online there are many ways there's much stuff about this to find out about the other ones. But if I gave you to go, it can be months before you can hit the other stuff. But you'll be surprised how quickly things start to change if you actually start to develop empathy and vulnerability within your team. You will be very, very surprised. Okay? So, sorry guys, thank you for listening. I believe there might be pizza on its way. But any questions?